Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here with us today for this important inaugural event, which is part of the Kelley Faculty Research Series featuring research from Professor Jeff Prince, How Much is Privacy Worth Around the World and Across Platforms. Before we begin, I would like you to choose the language you would like to listen to by clicking on the globe at the bottom right-hand section of your Zoom screen. Antes que empezamos, me gustaría si ustedes eligen el idioma de su preferencia.
I'd like you to choose the language
escogiendo
of your preference
el globito
by clicking on the small globe on the bottom of your Zoom screen. There you can choose English or Spanish.
And I'm the director of the IU Mexico Gateway in Mexico City on the campus of UNAM. The IU Mexico Gateway is part of IU's Global Gateway Network. And as many of you know, Indiana University is committed to building a truly global network. We have 5 Indiana University offices located around the world. We have an office in Bangkok, Thailand that serves the ASEAN region, Beijing that serves China, Berlin, Germany that serves Europe, New Delhi that serves the India region, and of course, Mexico City, which serves Mexico and is opening up into Latin America. The IU gateways are tasked with building relationships and with universities, institutes, nonprofits, governments, businesses around the world. We strive to create opportunities for research, partnerships, conferences, workshops, overseas study. We also support potential IU students and liaise with our local alumni chapters. We truly believe that bringing international experts and audiences together is often a starting point for which lasting relationships and important academic collaborations between universities and researchers, countries, and cultures can happen. And we think it's imperative that we continue to do this, whether we're in person or virtual, such as today. So without further ado, I would like to thank Dr. Nayeli Gervacio Mateo and Jeff Prince to be here today. Dr. Nayeli will be our moderator. But before we have our detailed introduction into them, I'd like to introduce you to my friend and colleague who invited us to kick off this incredible series, Tim Smith. Tim is the Director of International Relations and Business Development at the Kelley School of Business. Thank you so much for this wonderful invitation, Tim.
Thank you, Molly. It's so wonderful to be with you and be with all of you. Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this kickoff event of the Kelley Faculty Research Discussion Series. We're excited to once again partner with the IU Mexico Gateway and the Global Gateway Network to provide a new international platform for Kelley faculty to demonstrate their thought leadership in the school's many research areas. The Kelley Faculty Research Discussion Series builds on recent worldwide roundtable events held last October and March, when more than 1,500 people registered for live virtual roundtable discussions and breakout sessions originating from the IU Global Gateway offices. Business leaders around the world joined conversations about the importance of global connectedness and economic recovery post-pandemic. An event like this is a significant collaborative effort. Thank you to Molly Fisher and Lucero Guillen from the IU Mexico Gateway for hosting us and for your team's many contributions. And thanks to Ali Batten and OVPIA at Indiana University for our important and ongoing partnership. Thank you to the Kelley marketing team, IU Studios, and the Kelley Office of Development and Engagement for your contributions. To all of you, thank you for supporting and participating in this impactful, ongoing conversation with the global business community. We're thrilled to kick off the Kelley Faculty Research Discussion Series with 2 celebrated faculty. First, serving as today's moderator is Nayeli Gervacio Mateo. Dr. Mateo holds a bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degree in library science and information studies from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or also known as UNAM. She is an academic in the Humanities Department of UNAM and a professor and tutor of the postgraduate program in Library Science and Information Studies at UNAM. She has given lectures and national and international academic events, and Nayeli is a member of the Permanent Seminar on Information Policies at the Institute for Library and Information Research at UNAM. She was also a part of the board of directors of the National College of Librarians. She is also a member of the Asociación Mexicana de Bibliotecarios and the Federación Mexicana de Universitarias. She chairs the Joint Commission for Gender Equality of the Humanities Coordination as well at UNAM. Thank you, Nayeli, for moderating our Q&A session following the presentation. And to our participants, please be sure to submit your questions through the Q&A function during the Q&A session. Thank you. And now, please allow me to introduce my colleague at Kelley, Jeff Prince, who will lead today's presentation. Jeff is professor and chair of business economics and public policy at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. He is also the Harold A. Poling Chair in Strategic Management and co-director of the Institute for Business Analytics at Kelley. He recently served as chief economist at the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. His works have appeared in top general interest journals in both economics and management, including the American Economic Review, the International Economic Review, Management Science, and the Academy of Management Journal. He is currently co-editor at the Journal of Economics and Management Strategy and is on the board of editors at Information Economics and Policy. Jeff, thank you so much for leading today's important discussion. We look forward to learning from you and your recent research findings on consumers' data privacy views.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you, Molly. And I'm looking forward to our conversation, Dr. Mateo. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk to you about some of my recent work. I'll try to make this quick and to the point, because I'm also very excited to have some question and answer. I think it's always great to have some back and forth about new findings out there. So let me start by getting my slides up for everyone to see. All right. And get the slideshow going here. There, hopefully we're good to go. So as Tim said, what I want to talk about today is some recent work I've done looking at how people value their data privacy. And the focus of the analysis is to be doing a lot of comparisons, thinking about comparisons across different data types, across different data platforms, and then across countries, including Mexico. And so let me start by kind of setting the big picture. As I'm sure your presence here today, I'm sure you've thought about some of these issues. As we've seen in the last few years, governments around the world are grappling with data privacy policy. We've seen various attempts at different rules to put in place. Of course, Europe is well known for the GDPR. California put rules in place, and others are considering more. And one of the things that, as an economist, we're always thinking about trade-offs. And so any policy that various governments or private entities might consider has to balance things like the privacy preferences of those who are involved versus the benefits from the use of the data. So what are some perks or enhancements to products or services that might happen because the data are being shared? And so an understanding of privacy value can inform the regulations that are being considered concerning things like data ownership and rights, which has been discussed, consumer protection from data breaches and consequences thereof. And then also some recent concerns have arisen when we think about antitrust enforcement. And so, I'll talk about some of our empirical findings, and as we go through what we found, I'll come back and talk about what some implications might be for these types of applications. And so one of the things that I think motivates research in this area is that it's particularly difficult to measure privacy preferences. And I'm sure many of you have heard discussion about what's known as the privacy paradox, which can add another level of complication to these measures. And the privacy paradox really basically is this idea that many people have found that in various ways that people's stated preferences versus their implied preferences with regard to data privacy appear to be at odds. And so the idea being that in many applications or many instances, people will say they care a lot about privacy, but then at least in appearances, be willing to give up a lot of privacy relatively easily. So you think about, what we often give up when we use certain apps or certain other services online. It seems as though people will give that up quite readily, although when asked about it, they seem reluctant to do so. And so how do you square those two things? And so there's other work out there asking the question of, is it rationalizable? So is it the case that one could rationalize how someone with strong data privacy preferences would still tend to give up privacy on a regular basis? Or is a more nuanced theory necessary? So thinking about maybe some behavioral explanations for what seems to be contradictory behavior. Thinking more broadly, you think about what's out there in prior work, the general sentiment about privacy indicates at least some level of concern. And so others have shown that there are majorities, supermajorities, that believe current privacy laws are insufficient and that being in control of who can get their information is important. So at least at a high level, there does seem to be significant concern amongst various populations about data privacy. And just to give you a flavor of some of the empirical work that's out there, this is a lot to digest. So let me just walk you through a high level of what I'm trying to summarize here. You have various methods that people have used to try and get metrics for how much people value different types of data privacy. And if you look across the columns, particularly the second and third column, there's a couple different ways to think about the metric. You can think about what's known as willingness to accept. How much would you have to give me in order to give up certain data? And then you can think about willingness to pay. How much am I willing to give you in order to protect my data? So those are two different ways of thinking about valuation for your data privacy. And then there's various ways of trying to get those metrics. And that's where the third column comes in terms of methods. And so there have been hypothetical auctions, direct elicitation, so essentially asking people, what is it worth? There's what's called discrete choice experiments, which is what my work utilizes. So I will get into more detail about those in a minute. So those are the DCEs there. And then there's also been field experiments. So going out into the field and giving people actual choices and seeing what those choices imply about their willingness to pay and willingness to accept. And as you can see from the last column, there's been various different types of data that's been tried to evaluate with a wide range of results. So that's really the punchline from that table. So let me dive into some of the work that Scott Walston and I did. So what we did is we produced some new international results. So thinking about how people value their data across different countries and then also across platforms and types. And so what we use is conjoint survey techniques to measure, in our case, willingness to accept for online data privacy, for their online data. So how much would you have to give me in order to give up data to you in order that you could then distribute at your will? And so what we do is we compare and contrast these WTAs for a range of data types across 6 different countries, largely focused on Latin America. So we have Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and then Germany, Mexico, and the United States. And then we think about different types of data across 4 platforms. So we think about your bank, your wireless carrier, we think about Facebook, and then we think about your smartphone. And so how do we go about this? Well, the design of the surveys are very choice-based. So we offer choices with different levels of data privacy that go along with monthly payments. And this construct is not just out of thin air. So it's rooted in real and proposed data markets. So there was a beta project just a year or 2 ago called Data Coup, where you could actually go and offer up some of your online data in exchange for monthly payments. These types of models have been proposed in other contexts. So thinking about giving people some ownership of their data for which they could be compensated if they wish to give it up. And what's also nice about these types of surveys is they're well suited for measuring trade-offs. So the whole structure is based around this idea of, I give you different options, and then you can think about how do you trade off the different features of those options in order to identify the one that you like the best. And so let me give you a basic visual on what these would look like. And so here's an example of a choice that someone might make with regard to Facebook. And here what I have is 4 options, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then if you go down that first column, those are the different features of those options. So you'd say, if you had a Facebook account, I could potentially give you different options in terms of what information you're giving up, and then what monthly payment you would receive. And so one way to get at how does this tell me how you value different data privacy, for example, look at column option 2 versus option 3. Notice that with regard to collecting and sharing contact information, they're the same. With regard to reading and using text, they're the same. But with regard to sharing information about your friend network, option 2 does not and option 3 does. And then notice that there's a difference in payment between the two, between $3 and $3.50. And so how people make that decision, if they choose option 3 over option 2 or vice versa, gives me just a little bit of information about how they feel about sharing information about their friend network. So if you like option 3 over option 2, then you're willing to give up that information for 50 cents. And if it's vice versa, option 2 over option 3, then you're not. And so the idea behind these surveys is I give you lots of these choices. So I would ask someone, here are these 4 options, which one do you like the most? I would have that choice that was made, give that person maybe 9 other choices to make for Facebook, then do that with hundreds of other people. And then the aggregation of all those choices gives us quite precise estimates in terms of how they value different types of privacy. And so that's the basic construct of these surveys. Choices with trade-offs, and then aggregate up those choices to identify how people value different types of privacy. And so a few more details about the study that we ran. So we used a very large online survey firm called Dynata. At the time it was called Research Now. They've since merged to a larger firm. They administered these surveys for us. And so they have an international presence, which was great for us. We did 325 surveys per type, and a type is a combination of 3 things: what country it was in, what platform we were looking at, and then, as I'll describe later on, we also varied whether we gave a prompt up front, essentially giving them some extra focus on what the data were going to be used for, and that was either present or it was not. So I'll come back to what we learned from that as well at the end of this talk. And then we had basic screens on who participated in terms of their age, and then whether they had an existing account for the platform in question, for everything except for the banks. And then just some very high level, how do we do the analysis? The analysis is really based upon using choice data, using standard what's called conditional multinomial logit. Goes back to Daniel McFadden's work. It's essentially utility-based formulation. So essentially the idea is whichever choice that you make amongst the 4 options that you were given, we would say gives you the most utility. And then what I can do is, based on all those different choices that people made, I can estimate what the utility function looks like as comprised by these different types of data privacy and money. And so then what I can do is say, well, how does utility change depending on the amount of privacy you were given versus how does it change with how much money you receive? And I can take that ratio to get an idea of how much are different types of privacy worth to you in various units of currency. And in our case, to keep things on an even playing field, well, I'll talk about everything in terms of dollars, where we've converted the other currencies using purchase price parity. All right, so here's the fun part. now I get to show you some graphs. So what are some of the things that we find? So along the bottom there on the x-axis, you can see these are the different types of data privacy that we consider. So we have whether they share your balance, whether they share your fingerprint, whether it reads text, shares cash withdrawals, shares contacts, shares your browsing history, shares your voice print, shares information about your network, or shares location. And then on top of that, we had one other feature, which is, does it send you ads, right? So that's not really a privacy component, but it gave us another thing to benchmark against. And what we see here is sharing balance, sharing fingerprint come out on top, right? So people were they needed more money in order to be willing to give up that information to the various entities, the different platforms. And so if you notice, 2 of the top 4 have to do with financial information. So sharing balance, sharing cash withdrawals. And then fingerprint, of course, biometric also comes up pretty high. And then we've got reading text, another one that comes up pretty high. And then another thing to highlight here is notice that share location is actually the lowest of the set we look at, which in some ways may not be surprising, given that I think people have now come around to the idea that giving up their location can come with some perks, right? So when you think about directions, that can help in getting those efficiently. But on the same token, earlier research in this area often focused on location as being an area of concern, that people would be reluctant to give up that kind of information. But here it appears that it's certainly not high on the list amongst the ones we look at. Here's another graphic that I really like, and let me be clear about what it contains. So what we now have is the information I just provided in terms of how people value different types of online privacy, but now broken down by country with the color coding. And let me give you some highlights from this. One is, notice Germany is the orange color. Notice that Germany is on the left for almost all of the data types that we have, which indicates that Germany is having the highest willingness to accept for giving up that information for almost all of them, not all of them, but for the vast majority. Beyond that, another highlight that I would make is if you look at the other colors, their ordering shifts quite a bit as you go across the different privacy types. So while Germany stands out as being the highest, the rest of the countries change position across the different data types, suggesting there is no kind of dominant, next highest country in terms of valuation. And another thing that I think is interesting is looking at the sending of ads. So for several of the countries, you see that the bar actually goes down below the x-axis, indicating that they actually find it valuable to get the ads. So we found that for 3 of our countries. And broadly speaking, across Latin America, there seemed to be a strong non-aversion to receiving ads. Whereas if you notice orange and red, which is Germany and the United States, they are the 2 that had demonstrable aversion to ads. While it wasn't by a large number, clear distinction there from the Latin American countries. And then one more graphic. Again, I know there's a lot of information here, so let me give you a high-level summary. A key thing to note here is what I have is for the 4 different platforms: wireless, smartphone, financial institution, and Facebook, the different types of data that we valued for each of those platforms and what those valuations were for each of the countries. If you step back and just look at what the totality of the information implies, notice that the relative rankings are almost identical for every country. So the one that is considered with the highest willingness to accept, if you look at wireless, for example, share contacts is the highest bar for all 6 countries. And then you move to share browsing history is the second highest bar for almost all of the countries. Mexico, a slight exception, although not by much. And so if you look at that across all the different platforms, you'll see that pattern emerge over and over, that the relative rankings are quite comparable across all the countries. So let me highlight some key takeaways then from this. The relative values for privacy are similar across our 6 countries. And what does that imply potentially is that public and private policies may want to offer similar relative protections when it comes to different data privacy types. As I highlighted, financial and biometric privacy appears most valued, location privacy not so much. And then, as I also highlighted, Germany stands out as valuing privacy the most, especially their financial information. And this possibly could be due to historical reasons, right? Kind of going from one authoritarian regime to another, where there was a lot of surveillance. You can imagine that might stick in terms of having some aversion to people having a lot of your personal information at hand. Some key takeaways for Latin America: valuations are largely similar in magnitude, and there's not a consistent ordering in terms of first, second, third, fourth amongst our 4 Latin American countries. Mexico generally in the middle, right? So typically not on the high or the low end across the 4, often in the middle of the pack. And notably, there's less aversion to ads amongst this group. And as I said, even some indication of a preference for ads, which may be at least somewhat surprising. Although one thing we highlight in the new version that's coming out is that the Latin America has been emphasized as a hotspot for digital advertising recently. So there might be a relationship between what we're finding and that kind of more recent fact. Let me also describe a few additional findings that we had. So we also conducted some additional analysis to look at the distribution of preferences for online data privacy within the countries. So not everything I've presented to you thus far has been giving you averages. So on average, how are these different online data privacy types valued? We can also go further and think about tracing out a distribution of those preferences. So obviously some people in any given country might value them more and value them less. So we did try to trace out those distributions. And the within country variation, what we found is the within country variation in the value of privacy is similar across our 6 countries. So what that tells us is that tiered protections may have a comparable appeal across countries, right? So if you think about, you could have maybe in the private sector, you could have different types of options where one has, lots of protections, one has kind of medium level protection, one has lower protections at different prices. What this suggests is how those would resonate amongst the potential consumers may have a similar kind of distribution across the different countries. It also means that the distribution of support for public policies may be similar across the countries as well. And one thing to highlight, though, is that Germany is a bit of an exception. We find more homogeneous preferences within Germany as compared to the other 5 countries that we analyzed. Another finding that I think is of interest, this isn't even in the draft that's currently public, but will be in the next version that's coming out very soon, is that data privacy preferences are positively correlated. And this is true across all our data types and for all our countries. So the idea being that on average, if you see someone that has a strong preference for privacy of their location, then that's correlated with them having strong preference for privacy of their contacts, right? So we're seeing strong positive correlation in preferences for privacy. And what that suggests to us is that policies of bundled protections, where you think about putting restrictions for sets of data types, are unlikely to homogenize preferences. So oftentimes bundles are used to, for different product features, for example, we bundle them together in such a way that if the preferences are, often the economics of this is that if the preferences are negatively correlated, if I bundle them together, it makes people's preference for that bundle look more similar. But when they're positively correlated, as we're seeing here, it suggests that bundling together policies of protections for different data types is just going to spread out the distribution. So then you'll have those protections being extremely liked by some, and then much less liked by others, depending on where they are on the distribution in terms of how much they value their online privacy. We also did some other analysis with regard to demographics. So we looked for differences in valuation by sex, by age, and by income. Here's the graphical findings. So as you can see, there's very consistent differences by sex, very consistent differences by age, not so much by income. And we can quantify that a little bit. So female willingness to pay versus male willingness to accept versus male willingness to accept. Higher across the board, often by about 2 times as much. And then when you think about across age profiles, older willingness to accept is greater than younger willingness to accept across the board, often by 2, 3, or even 4 times as much. And then another interesting finding that we thought was that income does not predict this very well. So it does not seem to be that, you know, country differences that we find are necessarily due to differences in wealth or income. At least it's not suggested by our individual analysis across income. We're not seeing a consistent pattern that the wealthy value it more or less relative to the lower income groups. Some other findings that we had is that one thing I mentioned up front was this leading statement that we placed. So what we did was we randomized whether we put a prompt at the beginning of the survey, reminding people that giving up their data can result in some benefits for them. So allowing the platform that you're on to give up the data to third parties could have benefits like, you know, better targeted ads, you know, better products, things like that. Having that leading statement or not, so we randomized whether it was there, didn't make a difference in the estimates that we found. And what that suggests to us is that the valuations that we're finding are not easily manipulated by prompts. They're at least more innate than that. And so I'll wrap up. I know I'm getting to the end of my time. So let me wrap up by just highlighting some applications for some of our findings. So these could help inform data protection rules that some already exist. There's many more that are being contemplated. They can help in understanding the relative importance of privacy types. Location has often been a focus, but I think we've highlighted some others that could be very important. I think in particular, our financial information, our biometrics really emerged as being pretty important. These can help in crafting and enforcing policies concerning data security. And then last but not least, I think it can help in thinking about some antitrust issues. So there have been recent lawsuits here in the United States and I know elsewhere against some of the so-called big tech firms, Google and Facebook here in the United States. And I think this can help us to at least think through some of these issues that have to do with non-price effects when we think about antitrust analysis. And so even in these complaints in the United States, there are references to privacy protections. And so one way to think about that is to say, well, the level of privacy protection that a firm offers could be thought of as a feature of a product or a service. And is there a relationship between market power and the level of protection that's being provided? And is there suboptimal protection being provided due to market power? And if so, what's the harm in that, right? So how much welfare is being lost because of that? Having some understanding of how consumers value their data privacy could help inform some of those types of analysis. So that's the end of my kind of more formal presentation. I'd be very happy to talk some more if you all would like to discuss some question and answers. Maybe what I'll do is I'll keep one of my, what I think might be the most dense, informative slide up, but I'm happy to pull it down anytime. So let's see, Dr. Mateo, would you like me to just open the Q&A and get going, or how would you like to take it from here?
¿Les parece bien? Ya tenemos algunas preguntas.
We already have some questions, so maybe we can read them, but I would just like to thank all the organizers of this great event of the University of Indiana and UNAM, and especially Dr. Jeff for bringing this magnificent topic to the table. It is a very interesting and important topic because sometimes we prefer to surrender our private information. We accept to share it, or as you mentioned, to not use certain services or certain products from apps and platforms. So maybe the answer is, I do want to use these products and consume these benefits, but I have to accept to share my information. So, doctor, if it's okay with you, we can start with the Q&A section. We have a question. In your research, did you distinguish between privacy and right of publicity? While related, there is a sharp distinction between these two rights.
No, it's a great question. We did not phrase it in this manner, so I don't know if the way we did it is going to be fully satisfactory in terms of the distinction you're thinking of. The way we described it is the entity, so the platform in question, whichever survey you received, if that component of the option said yes, right, in the example I gave you. So thinking about it, it reads contacts, say, then the way we conveyed that was to say that then that platform would have the ability to sell that information to third parties. So that's the way we framed it. And so obviously that implies then, you know, you're giving up the privacy on that information, but it's not, I think there's some legal component to this, so I don't want to overstate my knowledge in this area, but I don't think it quite goes to the point of saying right of publicity, but it's a good question.
Okay, muchísimas gracias, doctor.
Thank you very much. We have another question. You mentioned in your presentation that you had certain indicators for the survey. The question is, was there any difference between age, demographics, and experience with technology?
No, it's a great question. So as I noted, so we did find big differences along age across the board. And then we also did find significant differences between male and female. But then I think also interesting, we did not find any significant difference across income. So those were the three demographics that we had detailed information on that we could run that analysis. It's a great question about experience with technology. I have seen other research go along that dimension as well. We unfortunately didn't have that information for our survey, but that would be an interesting take. There could be, I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that our age results might in some way proxy for experience with technology, but I don't want to say that too strongly.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Tenemos otra
Thank
pregunta.
you so much. We have another question. Is there any information about people's willingness to pay instead of receiving a payment, to keep their privacy?
No, it's a great question. Yes, there is. So there is prior work out there that has looked at willingness to pay. That's actually a couple of those. In fact, maybe I'll, where was that? Yeah, so several of the studies that I just cited, and this is by no means comprehensive, I just give these as some examples. So if you notice in the second column, that third study and the fifth study had a willingness to pay component to them. And so this is the idea that instead now we're thinking about how much would you pay to get the information protected. Now, one of the things that's been found is that generally speaking, it appears that willingness to pay is typically less than willingness to accept. But one of the things I would highlight is there's a lot of online data to be considered here, and I don't know if we can go so far as to say that's universal, but certainly some of the studies that have looked at this for the data that they analyzed, it appeared to be the case. But in our case, ours was focused on willingness to accept. Again, thinking about it in terms of some data markets we've already seen out there that have exactly the structure that we ended up putting together.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor. Tenemos otra
Thank you.
pregunta.
There's another question. They want to know your opinion about the application of this data for a multinational company serving, for example, German and Mexican markets.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I think there's a couple interesting takeaways. I mean, Germany and Mexico in particular, if you want to focus on that, I mean, one thing I would say is to the extent that you have flexibility, it would appear that the German market would place higher value on data protections that you would provide than the Mexican market, at least from these data. It would also suggest that in terms of how people value these data types, relatively speaking, it's quite comparable between the two countries, right? So while in absolute terms, maybe Germany would put higher value on data privacy, at least for these types. If you were thinking about it in relative terms, the relative profile you might think should be comparable because there does seem to be quite comparable relative rankings between those two countries. And in fact, pretty much all 6 of our countries exhibited comparable relative rankings. So yes, you could take advantage of this to think in terms of, you know, where might stronger relative privacy protections on the whole across countries be received most favorably. But then also, when you think about pitting different data types against each other, where should you be putting your resources for greater protection to the extent that there are trade-offs to be made? It suggests that those trade-offs are actually quite similar across those 2 countries and in fact all 6 of ours.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Tenemos otra
Thank you so
pregunta.
much. We have yet another question. They would like to know the difference between which countries could the willingness to I'm sorry, I lost the question.
Sí, que,
Sorry, she's going to repeat it. They want to know the difference between if countries could might be due to the different allocations of privacy or to the characteristics of their privacy or to a different status quo regarding privacy as such.
I mean, I think that's certainly plausible. Obviously, it's hard for us to dive into that with just what we have. I think that's a plausible explanation. I guess, you know, the flip side to that, in my opinion, is, you know, I was actually quite struck by a lot of the similarities. So in some ways, to the extent that one of your takeaways, you know, obviously they're not all exactly the same, of course. And so there's going to be some subjective interpretation in terms of what the kind of holistic conclusions would be from all the information I've just provided. But to the extent that, you know, a takeaway is there's quite a bit of similarity. And I think certainly outside of Germany, one could walk away with that conclusion. In some ways, it suggests that, you know, if you believe there were significant differences in status quo, they're not manifesting in very large differences in kind of the ultimate preferences that people are exhibiting, at least in our survey. So I found that to be quite interesting because I think, you know, obviously we could have even more heterogeneity across our countries. You know, we have a strong Latin American representation here. We don't have Asia, for example, we don't have Africa and others. So obviously it could vary significantly if we included those as well. But I would argue that even among the 6 that we have, you could make strong arguments that there might be differences in status quo and kind of other fundamentals that might feed into preferences, but our results suggest that they don't feed in overwhelmingly strongly, at least outside of Germany. That's one of the takeaways at least I've had from this.
Perdón. Quieren saber si el
They
tema
would also like to know if the topic is related to religion.
Wow, that's a tough one. It would be pure speculation on my part if that were the case. That's a really intriguing question, though. Boy, you know, those are always sensitive to ask in surveys. But if I were able to parse this out by religion, I'd be very curious to see if there are differences. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, but I've not seen that analysis. But I think that's a very fascinating question.
tenemos otra. Que
We have another question. If preferences among countries are similar, would it be easier to find an international agreement regarding privacy data protection? But that doesn't seem to be the case. Some countries want to use the information without any international limitations or regulations. Is that the case?
Well, okay, so I guess I feel like there are two parts to that. So I guess to the extent that, you know, there's significant comparability in terms of how constituents value privacy, certainly, I mean, that's not the end game, but that I think is fair to say would be favorable towards finding some international agreements on, you know, the level of protection to be provided. Now, I think to your second point, if I understand it correctly, it certainly would throw a wrench in that if you have, you know, significant players or entire countries that just disagree on that, right? So to the point where they don't think there should be restrictions. Obviously, that's going to make things quite difficult in terms of getting international agreements. So, I mean, this is obviously an evolving policy space a lot, and it's going to be interesting to see how different countries try to navigate this and how international firms try to navigate this. I mean, it's not directly comparable, but there are some similarities in that you know, international corporations have to deal with differences in antitrust law across different countries, and it seems like we're moving toward a place where they're also going to have to deal with differences in privacy laws. I mean, they already are, but I think that's going to continue to evolve.
Muchísimas gracias. También tenemos.
Thank you so much. We also have that in certain countries, such as China, free software is provided in exchange for data. How do you view such exchanges?
How do I view those? Oh boy. Okay, so now we're really going outside my work. I guess, I mean, me personally, I would say, as long as there's full disclosure, you know, I could see a deal like that being okay. And I think, you know, in some ways we have some things comparable to that in the United States, where, you know, the idea being you can have this product or service, but here's what you're giving up in exchange. Is that what you want to do? So, I mean, with full disclosure, I think that, you know, in general, I would say that's okay. I think, you know, one of the pushbacks that I'm very sympathetic to is, where does this fall into the context of choice? So is it the case that are we talking about a service that, you know, is strongly needed for which you don't have many choices or any choices. And so it's really a take it or leave it on the service when those kinds of offers are made. I think that's an interesting question to explore. You know, I think it's a lot easier to say, hey, it's no problem, you know, just decline the service if you don't like giving up the data. But in some ways that presumes that there are other choices that you can make. And so, you know, I think it would require some deeper analysis of the particular question in mind. So I could see it being more benign if it's some kind of niche entertainment product, but yet a little bit more of a concern if it's a product of kind of primary value that in some ways almost is near a necessity.
Okay, muchísimas gracias.
Perfect, thank you. We also have another question that says if the durability of the information might be contributing to the heterogeneity in valuations of different types of privacy. Ads are one-off, while privacy concerns related to sharing contacts or fingerprints are long-lived.
No, it's a great point. You know, I was just thinking about that exact question not too long ago. And I mean, I will concede in our analysis, we're not able to kind of directly get at that. But I think that would be a really great area for additional research, is exactly the framing you have in mind. And that's exactly what I was kind of thinking as well, is, you know, the difference in permanence of the data in question. And to build on that point, another thing I was thinking about is how much does the information vary over time? So another, I think, dimension that could be of interest is thinking about, say, fingerprint versus sharing balances, right? Your fingerprint is pretty much your fingerprint. So I give that up, I've kind of given it up. And so, you know, how does someone's thinking about that differ versus, say, sharing their balance, where that's kind of an ongoing concern, right? So I could share my balance with you today, but that may be very different a month from now or a year from now. Am I continuing to share that balance? Does sharing it now, you know, is that still of concern to me a year from now? Whereas if I share my fingerprint with you now, that may still be a concern, and very plausibly would still be a concern a year from now, because there isn't that kind of variability in that information. So I think those are really fascinating questions that are worth exploring.
Muchas gracias. ¿Quieren saber su opinión?
Thank you so much. They would like to know your opinion about what international organism should establish and enforce the data privacy laws in general.
Oh, that is a big one. I don't know if I'm willing to stick my neck out quite that far just yet. I think we're still relatively early in this game. That is a tough one. You know, there's obviously, you know, benefits and costs as you try to have some overarching body do this across, you know, many countries versus having each country kind of figure it out for themselves. I'm reluctant to give a firm opinion. To be honest, I would say that I haven't given that particular question enough thought to give you a well-reasoned enough answer. I guess I would just acknowledge that that's a complicated one, that, you know, there are arguments to be made on either side.
Muchas gracias, doctor. También.
Thank you so much. They also want to know if you think in time people will be more willing to share their data.
That's a good question. I mean, I guess one of the lingering questions here is I like to think about the age profile. So looking at our age results, we see big differences across age groups, and there's been variation in findings on this. Some have found not so much. We've found quite a bit variation along age. And I think a natural follow-up question to that is that your age or is that generational, right? And those have very different implications. And this is outside other reasons that things could change over time. But even if you just focus on the age issue, is it the case that the younger group, they are less concerned, and that's just a generational thing that will stick with them through their lives? Or is it the case that as people get older, they start to become more concerned about data privacy? As far as I'm aware, I haven't seen those two explanations parsed out in research. Now, of course, I reserve the right to be ignorant of a study that's out there, but I haven't seen that parsed out. But I think that's a really interesting question. And that's even aside from just some natural evolution of privacy preferences that may be occurring as people become more familiar with the technologies that utilize the data. But also, it could go either way. I think sometimes there's this inclination to think that people will just become more okay with it because they're used to using the technology. But on the flip side, there also is a stream of bad news that comes out. You hear about, say, big data breaches, and then it raises people's concerns, or at least potentially could. So I don't think it's obvious which way kind of the preferences overall would evolve with those different forces at play. But I also think the age question is a really interesting one. Is it just kind of generations feel differently about it, or is it that people adjust their preferences as they move through their lives?
Muchas gracias, doctor.
Thank you so much, Doctor.
Dr. Nayeli, sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt here. We've had so many amazing questions that the time has gotten away from us. So with that in mind, I think I can say that this has obviously been a really important and interesting discussion, and something that hopefully we can continue to discuss in person. We certainly look forward to the day where we can do this in person, but in the meantime, perhaps we can put our heads together over how to continue this conversation amongst ourselves and for everyone who's listening to us today. I really want to thank our audience for joining us, and Dr. Gervacio, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros moderando. We're so happy to have you here moderating today. And Jeff, thank you for this important research that you have put together and shared with us. I'm sure that I can speak from everyone at the IU Mexico Gateway office that we look forward to welcoming you in person. And on behalf of the Office of the Vice President of International Affairs at Indiana University and our hosts at UNAM, a huge thanks to everyone. And of course, Tim Smith and his team at Kelley and this inaugural event for the Kelley Faculty Research Series. So thank you. And to our audience, again, we will be sending you a follow-up email in the next couple of days that will have a recording of the event in Spanish and English, the language of your choice. And we look forward to staying in touch. Jeff, Dr. Gervacio, thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Muchísimas gracias, el placer mío.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
We look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.